Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Rain Check podcast about Edgar Atheling.
And his sister, St. Margaret.
I'm Austin,
And I'm Donna.
and we appreciate your patience. We were off for a week. There may or may not have been a mention of releasing a special episode about Sven the Second or something like that, or Harold or Godwin, but it did not come to pass. It was a very busy. I was in Europe for 2 weeks straight, which was very fun, but didn't leave a lot of time for a podcast recording. So we're coming to you with a kind of a special episode because it's our first episode that is not about a king of England because you really can't say that he was even king of England for like a day or like four, it's like he literally was never king of England, but he
He
was.
was proclaimed king. He just wasn't coronated or really. He was only
It's sort of
proclaimed king by a subset of English people.
it's sort of like if I just said I am the king or like Donna is the queen of England. It's like, well, I proclaimed you
Yeah,
queen.
it's
You were
more than
proclaimed.
that. It's more than that. He did have a very strong claim to the throne.
He did have a strong claim because he was the son of Edward the Exile, who, as you can guess, was exiled from England when Canute took power a while back. He was the next in line for the Wessex line. So they'd been hanging out in the mainland, and we're gonna get into it into Edgar's story, but yeah, he um I don't know. We essentially I'll just be honest that we're doing this episode partially because we were gonna record in Paris and it just was easier to kind of do like a it was too difficult to do a William the Conqueror episode. That just felt a little daunting. And we're also thinking for next episode it will be William, but we're likely going to do a part one and a part two because he was an important guy. We have a lot to say, and my mom
And he was Adela's father.
is a bit of an expert. I would say that you could be considered an expert on this specific time period of England. So look forward to that. We're gonna settle in for this time period because we'll probably do Edgar's daughter, Adela, who was also not a queen of England but was very important.
William's daughter,
Sorry, what
not
did I say?
Edgar's daughter.
Oh yeah, William's daughter. And so we are the Kings and Queens of England podcast, so we like to spread the love around, and we don't want to be restricted by a format. Real quick, I kind of did not to shout out a competitor, but I've been really addicted to this podcast ever since I got back from my trip called the Rest is History podcast. And I like that they are also not really restricted. They kind of just do episodes on what they feel like talking about. So I like having some structure of going through the Kings, but I like doing something that we're excited to talk about. So this episode is about Edgar Atheling, and he was born in around 1052 in the Kingdom of Hungary, which you don't hear that often
No, you
for
don't.
a king of England. That'll start maybe to get a little more common that they'll kind of be coming from other countries, but as I said, he was in the House of Wessex. His father was Edward the Exile, and his mother was Agatha.
We don't
And
know much about Agatha. There's like five different possible families she could have come from, so it's a mystery.
so Edgar, sometimes known as Edgar the Second, which is interesting. Um, was the last male member of the royal house of Cerdic of Wessex. After the death of Harold II in 1066, Edgar was put forward as king by the Archbishop of York and the leading citizens of London, with the support of Earls Edwin and Morcar, who I believe we had talked about last episode. They were in Northumbria when Harold Hardrada had attacked, and they kind of immediately kind of buckled to that attack.
Hmm.
But they're supporting him, so he was supported. Like we said, he actually did have a good amount of support by
And
the
London accepted him too.
yeah, but he was never formally anointed. And he was one of the English nobles who will submit to William. And
Yeah, I think that several of the English nobles and, as you said, the Archbishop of York wanted Edgar, but Edgar's only 14. And meanwhile, William's off continuing to fight his way towards London. He's, won the Battle of Hastings, but he hasn't yet won the throne. He still had more fighting to do, but he was winning. And so I think the supporters of Edgar, and especially those in London, where William was headed, were watching the progress and thinking, do I really want to be opposed to William right now? So,
you don't want to, yeah, you don't want to be opposed to William. But one thing I did see while reading about our guy Edgar was that he was not very lucky. He keeps choosing sides that keep losing,
yeah,
essentially. And it's actually, though, a really interesting story. I'm glad we're doing this episode because I just feel like he lives for a long time for someone who you think William would have just immediately killed. That's the thing that's
right.
a little bit
Or at
confusing.
least imprisoned. It is kind of crazy.
It's weird.
William has such a
Yeah,
bad rep, but he was super nice and forgiving to Edgar.
it is interesting. I know, and I maybe I'll have a theory once we talk through his life, but yeah, that we keep hearing about these kings who kill their brothers and kill their brother-in-law and kill their dad and kill their son and whatever, or their cousin. And now in the case where, he's this foreign conqueror, so he's not super welcomed, and there's this kid who's a pretty strong, has a strong right to the throne, and he just sort of lets him kind of live in Hungary and live in Scotland and all this stuff. So yeah, jumping into it, yeah, as I said, he was born in Hungary, and just to say, so his father was Edward the Exile, who was son of Edmund Ironside, um, and yeah, as I
And
said,
remember, Edmund
yeah,
Ironside was the son of Ethelred the Unready, and Edmund and Canute had kind of split England after multiple battles had kind of resulted in a tie. But then Edmund died just a few weeks after that decision.
right. So Edward and his son Edgar had been, and his mom Agatha were hanging out in Hungary, and
With two sisters. He had a sister Margaret and then a younger sister.
hmm, and his mom Agatha was a relative of the German emperor, which is pretty cool. And yeah, his two sisters, Margaret and Christina, who were younger than him. And basically, in 1057, Edward the Exile arrives in England with his family, but dies almost immediately. And so Edgar, as a child, was left as the only surviving male member of the royal dynasty apart from the king, Edward the Confessor. So we're in, right? So Canute's dead. That's why Edward is able to come back, and but then he dies. But then Edgar is with his great uncle, Edward the Confessor, and he's brought up by the Confessor's wife, Edith, and is recorded um, as Clito, which is Latin for eighthling, which is a royal prince eligible for the throne. And
And it's interesting that Edith was raising him because Edith supported her brother as king, not Edgar.
right, that yeah, but he was a kid, so she's got to look after him. And some people think that Edward chose Edgar as his heir, but this is questioned by other historians who argue that Edward does not appear to have taken any steps to support his candidacy. But who knows? So then, as we know, Edward the Confessor dies in January 1066. Edgar's still in his early teens, and Harold uh, Godwinson becomes king, as we know. And modern historians think that he was just too young to be considered, an effective leader at this
Mm-hmm.
time, because it's not, as we know, there's a lot of war and fighting going on right now. Um, and let's see. So um, Harold was king, and basically after Harold's death at the Battle of Hastings, some of the Anglo-Saxons decided to back Edgar's claim to the throne, which sort of makes sense. You still don't want William to take over from
Mm-hmm.
Normandy. And yeah, like I said, anyway,
Then
there's no
we get back
evidence.
to where we were saying before that they supported him, but as they saw William keep winning more and more battles, it kind of looked inevitable that if William went against Edgar, William was going to prevail.
Yeah. And the Anglo-Saxon chronicles say that, there's no evidence he was elected by a official Witan, but, the steps were being taken for that to maybe have happened. And let's see. So then he is exiled um to, let's see, where?
To
Hungary.
Scotland.
Oh, Scotland.
Oh, well, he may have had a slight time in a time period in Hungary, but he ended up in Scotland in 1068. So for 2 years, I'm not sure. Maybe he was in Hungary
Oh,
during those
true,
two
right?
years.
Yeah. So yeah, those couple years, it's a little unclear. It seems like he was actually even kept in his court for a little bit, and then might have actually helped out his, uncles Edwin and Morcar. There was a rebellion that didn't work out. He might have been trying to return to Hungary and been blown off course, but he somehow ended up in the court of King Malcolm III of Scotland. And he actually ends up then marrying Malcolm's sister, Margaret. Oh, sorry,
No,
Malcolm,
no.
Edgar's sister, Margaret.
Malcolm fell in love with Margaret, Edgar's sister,
Right.
and married her. And she and Malcolm ended up having 8 children that survived and even more children that had died along the way. So they had quite a few children. And she's a really interesting person. She really tried to kind of calm Malcolm down and introduce a lot of piety into the Scottish court. She was very renowned for her piety and her kindness, and she would she did what most queens of the time would do, where she promoted education and she encouraged church reform and she supported monasteries and abbeys. But she did even more, like she established a special ferry crossing that people could use to visit on their pilgrimage to a sacred site. And then she fed the poor every day. And
Hmm.
then I don't know if it was just once a year or more regularly, but she would wash the feet of beggars herself.
Well,
So she became known for combining deep religious devotion, but also was known as a person that was genuinely compassionate and not just doing it for show. And you can still see her chapel if you go to Edinburgh today.
oh wow. Okay. Yeah. So then when later on we're gonna get into the Herring of the North that William's gonna do. And so Edgar returns to England like with the rebels, and he kind of leads some of the rebels, but as we know, that doesn't work out. So he goes back to
But
Malcolm.
again, William forgives him and doesn't kill him.
It really is kind of crazy. And so then this is what I was thinking of. Then Edgar marries Malcolm's sister, Margaret Canmore, and they seem to have a good marriage as well. So that's good. So that's what's so interesting is that Edgar is this unlucky guy, as we're going to get in. Well, as we already know, and as we're going to keep seeing, like he's obviously not going to be super successful, but he does have a lot of going for him. William keeps pardoning him, and he has a good wife, and his sister gets married off and has a good life and all this stuff. So he actually has kind of a solid career, even though he never actually becomes king. So then in late summer that year, the arrival of a fleet sent by King Swen of Denmark, triggered a fresh wave of English uprisings in parts of the country. So then he sails to this place, the Humber, which is in like northern England, I believe, and he links up with the Northumbrian rebels and the Danes, and they actually overwhelm the Normans at York and take control of Northumbria. But then later on in the year, William fights his way into Northumbria and buys off the Danes, and he kind of destroys the area. So we're gonna get
Yeah,
into
let's
that.
talk about that next
Well,
week.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a whole thing. And
But Edgar submitted to William again and was forgiven again.
yeah, let's see, he sends them to a marshy, or no, so they seek refuge in some marshy region, and then he returns to Scotland. Yeah, he stays there till 1072. And this is when William invades Scotland and forces King Malcolm to submit to his overlordship. And one of the terms of the agreement includes the expulsion of Edgar. So then this is when he goes to Flanders, which is in current day Belgium, I
Which is
believe.
interesting because Flanders is where William's wife is from. Remember, Matilda is the daughter of the Count of Flanders, Count Baldwin, but I don't know if her father is still Count at this time. It's probably her brother, and her brother was always causing problems for her.
Yeah, quick anecdote. I was on a tour of the Louvre a couple days ago when I was in Paris, and the tour guide was French, but she really had a strong affinity for like Northern European art, and she showed us a lot of like the Dutch artists, and she was essentially saying that the Dutch and the Belgian and Flanders Flemish people were underrated for a lot of things in art, and we always think of the Renaissance as centered in like Italy and that area, but there's a lot going on up there too. So I encourage people to check that out. And yeah, it makes sense that England has a connection with them because they're right across the water. So right when he gets there, he gets an offer from Philip the First, King of France, who obviously is not the best friends with William of England, and at the time especially. And so he gives him some lands in Normandy, and so then he heads for France, but a storm actually wrecks their ships on the English coast, and many of Edgar's men were hunted down by the Normans, not the Mormons. And he managed to escape back to Scotland. So he's back in Scotland again. And following this disaster, he was persuaded by Malcolm to make peace with William and return to England as his subject, abandoning any ambition of regaining his ancestral throne. So,
And then I see that William in 1074 gave Edgar a pension. So not only did he forgive him for all this rebellion, but he gave him an annual pension.
it's almost like Forrest Gump or something. That's what
I
it's
know. I don't
reminding
really
me of. It's
understand
like
it.
British Forrest Gump. So then he, you know, after all that, you think Edgar would be grateful that he's alive after all this, but he's upset the level of disrespect and he doesn't get as much compensation as he wants from William. So he renounces his allegiance to the conqueror, and he moves actually randomly to southern Italy, to this area called Apulia, which I
That's
have a
what I was
map.
going to say. That's where the Normans were. So it's kind of odd.
It's very strange. Everything about his story literally makes no sense. But he gets shipwrecked trying to get from Flanders to France, but he goes all the way to southern Italy, which at the time is quite far. Um, and yeah, it's this southern, pretty sizable chunk of kind of the boot section of Italy called the Duchy of Apulia and Calabria, and which I actually want to look more into because it does sound interesting. I don't think it lasted for it very long, but
No, but the Normans had gone there and taken over a lot of the territory.
yeah. So basically, it the records kind of show that he really thought he was going to stay here forever because he sort of renounces his properties in England. But as we're going to see, he's not going to in a few years he returns back to England. So he just we don't really know what he does there, but he,
But
tries it
he
out
did.
in
I
Italy.
read he went on the crusade. I guess it was the first crusade.
Actually, I'm not there yet. I am going to get to that,
Okay,
but somehow
sorry.
this, yeah, somehow that's a separate trip. So this guy,
Okay.
he is a world traveler. So then there's this Norman and Scottish strife. So we're jumping ahead to King William's death in 1087, and Edgar supports William's eldest son, Robert Courthose. Is that how you pronounce it? Courthose?
I guess so. It was an insult that William gave to his son, to short legs.
Is there a better name I can call him that's not so
No, that's what he's
derogatory?
commonly known. You could call him Robert Duke of Normandy, but
That sounds better. Yeah, so he, as you said, becomes now Duke of Normandy against, and then the second son, William Rufus, gets the throne of England as William II. So Edgar was actually one of Robert's three principal advisors at this time. Pretty cool. Um,
although really, Robert, do you want to be taking your advice from Edgar Athley? He hasn't been super successful.
Robert was very different from his father, but one thing he seems to have gotten is his illogical love of Edgar Atheling. Edgar must have just been like a really nice guy. Like everyone seems to just it's like, oh, it's Edgar. Like, what? We're gonna kill that guy? Come on, let him go to southern Italy, have some nice time with the sun. Um, so basically, there is this little kerfuffle with Robert and his allies to try to overthrow his brother that they're defeated. So it's one in many defeats that Edgar is facing in his life. That's in 1091. And as a part of the settlement between the brothers, Edgar was deprived of the lands he had been granted by Robert. So he loses his lands again,
And
which
I think this is when Robert and Rufus made their pledge to one another that they would be each other's heirs if one of them died.
so interesting. Um, so disgruntled Edgar travels once again to Scotland, where Malcolm is preparing once again for war with a man named William. Different William. So William II marches north, and the two armies fight each other. Or sorry, they do not fight, which is pretty cool. I like when this happens. They just decide the two kings are just going to talk it out. So the negotiations were actually conducted by Edgar on behalf of Malcolm, and he was talking to Robert on behalf of William. So it's actually Edgar and Robert are the two that end up resolving the fight. And there's a reconciliation between William and Edgar. As we said, he just
It's
can't.
kind of interesting because both Malcolm and William Rufus were big on fighting. So it's
Mhm.
interesting that those two settled instead.
This is what I'm saying. I think Edgar might secretly be like one of the most underrated people in British history because he's just like, yeah, I negotiated just out of a battle, which never happened back then. And yeah, every William loves me. So then, however, within months, Robert left England, unhappy with William's favor to fulfill the pact between them. And Robert went back, left England, and Edgar went with him to Normandy. So now he's in Normandy. And anyway, okay.
I wonder what his wife thought about all this
I
traveling
know. I
around.
I would have cut some of this out, but I do think it's interesting to just see how many places he went because nothing even happens in Normandy. He just then goes to Scotland again in 1093 on a diplomatic mission for William to negotiate with Malcolm, who was dissatisfied with the Norman failure to implement in full the terms of the 1091 treaty. So even though they
Just
have
let
the
me tell
treaty,
you, as a side note, as you can tell from this is twice that someone's been dissatisfied with the failure of William Rufus to fulfill his promises.
Mhm.
Why anyone would believe William Rufus is unknown to me because he never
He
fulfills his
never
promises.
Interesting. Okay. That is good information. So then, because of all that, there's a war. An actual war is happening now. So, um, Malcolm invades England, but he is killed along with his heir Edward, which was the eldest of his sons, in the Battle of Alnwick. So Malcolm's successor was his brother Donald Bon. So Donald drives out the English and the French retainers who had kind of risen high up in the ranks in Malcolm's court. And so that he does that. He kind of purges them out. And so William then helps Malcolm's eldest son, Duncan, who had spent many years as a hostage at William's the first court. And anyway, he tries to get him to take over the throne, but Donald regains the throne, and Duncan gets killed. Another effort to restore the Anglo-Norman interest through sponsorship of Malcolm's sons was launched in 1097, and Edgar made yet another journey to Scotland, this time in command of an invading army. Donald was ousted, and Edgar installed his nephew and namesake Malcolm and Margaret's son, this other Edgar. So Malcolm had a son, Edgar, and now he's the king of Scotland. And now we are getting to the First Crusade. So
I'll just make a note there that Margaret, his sister, had three sons that ended up being kings of Scotland and a daughter who becomes Queen of England.
okay. So I'm not going to get into all the stuff with the First Crusade. I might save that for
We can talk about that on the Adela episode too.
Yeah. But on March 4th, 1098, a fleet manned by Englishmen, probably members of the Varangian Guard, commanded by Edgar, sailed into Port Saint Simeon, the medieval port for the Frankish Principality of Antioch, right here, which is near Syria, bringing supplies of siege materials from the Byzantine Emperor for the First Crusade. William of Malmesbury wrote that Edgar made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1102. So he also
Just to note, so at the First Crusade, they went pretty quickly from Constantinople to Antioch and were successful in their fighting along the way.
Mhm.
And Stephen, Adela's husband, wrote back to Adela and said, "Oh, like I think we'll be to Jerusalem like in a month or so." And then they ended up getting stuck at Antioch for, I'll have to check my memory, but like a year, maybe a year and a half, a long, 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 long time, and almost lost everything there. So I hadn't realized that Edgar came and brought them supplies, it sounds like, at
Right,
Antioch.
that must have been when that was happening, yeah.
Mm.
And then this William of Malmesbury, who is this historian sort of guy later on, he states that on the way back from Jerusalem, Edgar was given rich gifts by both the Byzantine and German emperors, and they also each offered him an honored place at their court, but he insisted on returning home instead. So again, everyone loves Edgar. Like everyone just wants to be his friend.
And
He
where was his home? Was he considering home to be Scotland at that point, Normandy,
That's
or
a good
England?
question. Yeah, that's a good question. And he apparently said people are sometimes so misled by love of country that they can't enjoy anything unless they breathe familiar air. So he's essentially saying that he's homesick. Homesick. So this is sort of his later life now, and he's back, I guess, in England, and he takes the side of Robert Curthouse in the internal struggle for the Norman dynasty, this time against Robert's youngest brother, who is now Henry I, King of England, who we'll talk about eventually. So that's one thing that I kind of like talking about Edgar is he's almost this like side character. He's like this Forrest Gump
Well, not
character.
only that, but Edgar's niece marries Henry. So you're telling me that Edgar fought for Robert against Henry, but his sister marries Henry.
Oh,
And
wow.
Henry needed that marriage because Henry basically stole the throne from Robert while Robert was returning from a successful, heroic effort at the First Crusade. And William Rufus had conveniently died on a hunting expedition with Henry. And so Henry needed to legitimize his claim as quickly as possible. And so he thought by marrying Edgar's niece, um, who had the Anglo-Saxon blood, that he would, get some support from the people that missed the Anglo-Saxon dynasty.
Right. Man, yeah, I'm excited to get into those episodes. So, Robert, yeah, gets taken prisoner in this final battle of Tinchbray, and he gets imprisoned for the rest of his life. But Edgar is more fortunate because he's Forrest Gump, so he's not going
So
to go to
even
jail.
Henry forgave him, huh?
Apparently, yeah. So even Henry, loves him, and he gets pardoned and released. I mean, I don't know. When you read the history, it's just so straightforward of like, yeah, and then this happened. But when you say it out loud, it's like, what is happening? Like, why is he just never getting, sent into jail or anything? So anyway, yeah, as you said, his niece Edith, who gets renamed Matilda, and is the daughter of Malcolm III and Margaret, marries Henry in 1100. And Edgar is believed to have traveled to Scotland once more late in life because he just can't let Scotland go, perhaps around the year 1120. And he lived to see the death at sea in the White Ship in November
Oh,
1120 of
whoa, whoa,
William
whoa.
Adeline.
Edgar was on the white ship?
No, he just was alive to see that happen.
Oh, okay.
So
We don't
it's
want
just
to, we don't want to, we don't want to tell the white ship story yet.
okay, yeah. All we know is there's a white ship. Um, Edgar was still alive in 1125, according to William of Malmesbury.
Oh, that's when Adela died.
Wow, he wrote that he's writing like contemporarily, I guess, and he's saying that Edgar now grows old in the country in privacy and quiet. And Edgar died sometime after this, but no one knows the exact date or the location of his grave. According to some sources, he had one child, Margaret Lovell, who was I don't know, related, marries some nobility later on. There's two references to Edgar Atheling found in the Magnus Rotulus Pipae Northumberland, which are just called the Pipe Rolls, in the years 1158 and 1167. So he would be really old by then. He would be like 112 or
Oh my
something.
goodness.
So he probably wasn't really alive then, but who knows? He's kind of like Elvis. People keep seeing him. And the last thing I'll say about that is there's this historian writing in this book, The History of the Norman Conquest of England, says that this was the same Edgar, aged over 100, a son of his or some other person known by the title Atheling. So I don't know. He seems like he lived for a really long time, no matter what exactly happened.
Despite all odds, and was
Yeah, and
well
it's true.
traveled.
He's well traveled. I guess he just sort of realized, like, you know what? There's no chance I'm actually going to be king at this point. I am lucky to even be alive, but because he stopped,
Thinking
being involved in
maybe
the court. But
I'm thinking maybe that's one reason he kept being pardoned because no one thought like Henry imprisoned his brother Robert because Robert had the strongest claim to the throne and he was a real threat. But maybe he didn't see Edgar as a true threat, although
must
it
not
that
have.
hasn't often really kept people from being murdered or imprisoned.
And what's weird is like he literally was a threat multiple times because he literally is
Yeah,
leading rebellions. He's supporting anyone who's against
he
the
ha-
current king.
he
Like
has a legitimate claim.
I need to honestly maybe before next episode I'll dig further in because yeah, I hadn't quite realized how weird it is that it's one thing to get pardoned initially by William, but just the amount of times he escapes any sort of punishment is
Yeah,
pretty
and when we get to the War of the Roses, we'll see Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, ends up having killed multiple pretenders to the throne that he feels might threaten his reign. So,
right. And Yeah, I don't know. I like we're finally getting it feels like this is the first person we've talked about on the podcast who did a lot of traveling. It feels like most of these other kings have kind of just been in England and maybe they go to France a little bit, but he went to Normandy, obviously he went to Scotland, southern Italy, Jerusalem,
He was born in Hungary.
born in Hungary. So he was really a man of the world.
Hmm.
And I think we're going to start seeing more of that, though. As we know, it's the beginning of the Crusades. So it feels to me like when England is kind of like opening its eyes to the rest of the world and kind of seeing, like, oh, yeah, there are these other countries beyond France. And maybe we know a little bit about Flanders and Germany and stuff like that. But we're going to go all the way to the Near East. So, yeah, that was Edgar Atheling. An
And his
interesting
sister
guy.
Margaret.
And his sister Margaret. Anything else you want to say about Margaret?
I mean,
Mark?
I've read books about her. I should be able to say more about her. She's a very interesting person. It's cool to go in her chapel because it's one of the few things you can find from that time period that hasn't been completely reconstructed. So you can see the what it was like. It's kind of a simplified form of chapel and very calming. And I feel like she was just had a very calming energy that she brought to this time period that was so full of roughness and war and all this stuff. I feel like she had a good vibe that she brought to the
It really seemed
place.
like maybe this family just had a good vibe, like maybe there's something about his parents and maybe something about growing up like in a different place or something that
Mhm.
they both seemed like everyone liked them a lot and they were pretty peaceful and yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I wish we could know more about their personalities and smaller details because we kind of just know the big picture stuff, but you can kind of put together an
Yeah,
idea. And
and I'm also frustrated with the art from the period because you can look at these statues on these busts from ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and you can see exactly like what the man or woman looked like. Maybe it's an idealized version a little bit, but they look like real people. And
right,
then, yeah, this
this
is
is
what
what
we
we
see
have.
from this time period.
This is basically what we got for Edgar. I know. And it's like, okay, so I guess he had curly hair. He had hair for sure, and he liked
They
blue.
all basically look the same in these
No, it's really
illustrations.
dumb, honestly. Like yeah, I can understand, like they haven't learned, all the advanced Renaissance art techniques, but you think they could at least figure out like a caricature of some sort that they're gonna make them
Yeah,
seem more obvious what they look like.
it almost makes me wonder if this wasn't a chosen style. Was it because they had forgotten the skills? Or was it because, I don't know, either they didn't have time to work on art because there were so many battles going on,
Hmm.
or they just happened to like this style, kind of like the Impressionist period. People could
Hmm.
have said, well, why aren't you being realistic anymore? So maybe it was just some sort of phase. I don't know.
Yeah, I have read things about that, like how the medieval art style was more of a choice than a necessity. So that's interesting. Yeah. Um, I'm not sure why, but I'm sure they had a good reason to make it look like this. All right, so yeah, as we said, look forward to next week. It'll definitely be about William the Conqueror. Does he have other nicknames? William, Duke of
The Bastard.
Normandy, the Bastard. Uh,
Also, as you're showing the Bayeux Tapestry scene, Um, I think I mentioned on an earlier episode that I think it's at the British Museum, sold more tickets in one day than they had ever sold in the history of the museum for people to see the tapestry while it's going to be in England for the year. So if you're going to be over there, I mean, I've seen it in Bayeux, so I'm not sure because Bayeux isn't that far from England, so I'm not sure why it's so popular to see it in England, but
yeah.
it is definitely worth seeing. And there's this whole uh, Facebook page that I follow with a woman who is recreating stitch by stitch the Bayeux Tapestry and has been working on it for years because she's doing it all by herself. And Yeah, it's really interesting if you're into tapestries or recreation things. She's a cool person to follow.
We should do a once we get to like a special, or I guess just someday we should go to England and we can have some content for the
Ooh, that'd
podcast.
be fun. Yeah.
We can like take video of the tapestry or something.
Hmm.
All right. Well, until next time, this has been the Rain Check Podcast. See you later.
Bye.